Thank you, Virginia. One of the really fun things about being on the speaker committee with the symposium board is being able to invite old friends and colleagues to come and talk to us. And in this case, Ed Bernbaum and I have been friends and colleagues for 3 decades. And I'm delighted to be able to get Dr. Edwin Bernbaum to join us. He did his bachelor's in mathematics at Harvard, and then he went on to do his master's and PhD at Berkeley. And he's a lecturer, an author, and a scholar, and also a mountaineer who's done a lot of pioneering mountaineering work and was president of the Harvard Mountaineering Club. Ed is the 2 books he's really famous for is The Way to Shambhala and Sacred Mountains of the World, which is going to be reprinted now by Cambridge University Press, coming shortly. And he says it's a completely revised version of his earlier one. So even if you have that, it's beautiful with wonderful photographs. And I'm looking forward to seeing the new edition. We were colleagues when he was director of the Sacred Mountain program at the Mountain Institute, and have remained in touch ever since. Ed's had exhibitions at the National Geographic Society, at the Smithsonian, at the Museum of I can't remember which museum it was, Museum of Art, and around the world, and has led many lecturing tour groups to remote places in every continent, although I don't know about Antarctica. But Ed, we're so glad you could join, and it's just great. Thank you. I'm sorry that even though you're there in Berkeley, we're still not able to get you in person. But I'd like to hand it over to you, Ed.
Well, thanks very much, Gabriel. Very nice introduction. And it was great to get back in touch with you. And I'm going to be talking about sacred mountains around the world, but I'll also be talking about some projects that Gabriel played a key role in instigating. So he's one of the culprits involved in this talk. So why don't I launch into the pictures? I'll go into share screen now. And okay, let's see. Okay, so my talk is on sacred mountains of the world, subtitle Heights of Inspiration. And almost all the pictures you're going to see are ones that were taken by me, with a couple of exceptions. So, often people say, well, sacred mountains, that's a rather esoteric subject. And I say, on the contrary, it's not, because if you start to look at what sacred mountains involve, they almost automatically become associated with the highest and deepest values and aspirations of cultures around the world. So they take you straight into the heart of what it is that really inspires people. And that's what I hope to show in these slides, the many diverse ways in which mountains can do that, not only in traditional cultures, but also in modern society. So let me proceed. A little bit about how I got involved. I grew up partly in South America. My father was in the Foreign Service, and my earliest memories were of snow-capped peaks like this one on the equator. This is Cotopaxi, formerly the highest active volcano in the world, about 19,500 feet. And when I was sort of drawn, I had a love of snow, and I got involved with an Ecuadorian mountaineering club as a way of getting up the snow on the equator, which sounded intriguing. And when I went up, I found this wonderful world of magical fantasy, wind-sculpted glaciers like this on a peak near the equator. I then, because one of the teachers I had in high school was the first Peace Corps director in Nepal, and I learned about the people and the culture as well as the highest mountains. So I wound up going to the Peace Corps in 1968, and I went on an expedition which led to this mountain here, Annapurna South. Annapurna was the first of the world's highest peaks to be climbed, And it played a role in inspiring my interest in mountains, because when I was a teenager, my younger sister checked the book out of the library titled Annapurna, which she thought was a story about a mystery story like Nancy Drew about a girl named Annapurna. When she opened the book and realized it was about a mountaineering expedition, she tossed it aside. Well, she was right. Annapurna is a girl, it's a goddess named Annapurna. And we went on the expedition here, and you notice this cloud coming down off the peak. That's an avalanche. We were trying to go up to where this glacier is here, and that glacier there broke off and caught us in an avalanche that swept me down about 1,000 feet and buried me. It was a life-changing experience, which I won't go into here. But after that, I went out to the area around Mount Everest, and there's a monastery there. Some of you, if you've trekked there, it's named Tengboche. And up above it was this beautiful peak, which I managed to climb. And we thought it was an unclimbed peak. It's just under 20,000 feet. And for 11 years, I had the pleasure of thinking I'd made the first descent of this peak. And then I ran into somebody in Berkeley who climbed it before us. So I figured, 11 years was a pretty good run. And we did climb it by a new route. And this is what it looked like on the summit. It was certainly the most difficult peak I've ever climbed. Now, I came back down from the peak, actually, and came back to the monastery on Christmas Day and wound up trekking back to Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal, 11 days through the Himalayas and foothills of the Himalayas with the abbot or head lama of the monastery, whom you see here on the left. This is me in a much younger incarnation. I came back on projects to list and microfilm Tibetan texts, which led to my first book, The Way to Shambhala. And this, I'm not in a monk's robe. This is a Tibetan nobleman's robe that the Lama had given me. And you can see the monastery behind and the rhododendron flowers. So I got interested, I'd been drawn to snow and I'd been drawn to mountains, and there was something magical and transcendent about going up high. And then I became interested in what people thought of mountains and what they meant to them. And that eventually led me to the topic of sacred mountains of the world. So let's start off with the highest mountain on Earth, at least from sea level, and that's Mount Everest, which you see here. This is a picture I took of it from Tibet. And if you notice, just to the left of the summit is a little star. It's the planet Jupiter. Well, I wrote a caption for the first edition of my Sacred Mountains book saying Jupiter is Zeus in Greek mythology, so that makes Mount Everest the original Mount Olympus, where Zeus lives. However, in the book, the printer thought it was a glitch in the photograph, and he blacked it out. Then I had an exhibit at the Smithsonian Institution, and they called me up and they said, we think there's a glitch in the photograph. And I said, no, keep it in. So it's in. Now, Everest has assumed a kind of a semi-sacred status in the modern world as the highest mountain in the world. There's sort of mystique that's developed around it. One of the ways of looking at the sacred is something of ultimate value. And for many people, whatever is the highest or number one is of ultimate value. Now, here you see some British climbers who were trying to climb it back in the 20s. And as you can see, they're at 28,000 feet, not far from the summit of the mountain. And it looks like they're out for a stroll in knickers and tweed jackets. They were really tough back in those days. So because of this fascination in the West with, and also other parts of the world, Japan in particular, with the highest mountain in the world, people project onto this mountain their views of what it should be for the local people, namely the Sherpas and the Tibetans who live on either side of the mountain. And the name of the mountain in Tibetan is sometimes pronounced Chomalungma or Chomalangma. And you'll almost always find this mistranslated as Goddess Mother of the World or Goddess Mother of the Universe. That's because people assume, outsiders, that Everest is the highest mountain, must be the abode of a supremely important deity. Well, as it turns out, there's no mother goddess in Tibetan Buddhism to begin with. And this is a picture of the goddess of the mountain, who's a relatively minor goddess. She confers worldly benefits of long life, wealth, and that kind of thing, but not the higher transcendent benefits of enlightenment, for example, in Buddhism. And her name is Jomo Myolang Sangma. Now, what happens is, in Tibetan, the Tibetan language is monosyllabic. That means every syllable is like a word, has a meaning. And rather than make acronyms in Tibetan, the way we do with letters, they do it with syllables. So they'll take a long name, which is Jomo Miolang Sangma, and they'll shorten it down, as you can see here where I've underlined it, to Jomo Langma. So the name of Everest is the name of this goddess, who's a relatively minor goddess. Now, in terms of sacred mountains that are really important, in fact, the most sacred mountain in the world for maybe 1 billion or more than 1 billion people in Asia, and also immigrants who've come here, for example, to the West, which is also sacred to, as the most sacred mountain in the world to about 4 different religious traditions, is this mountain here, named Mount Kailas. It's in Western Tibet. It's only 22,000 feet high, 7,000 feet lower than Everest, but it stands out by itself, and it has the shape of almost like a dome or a temple. And you notice the gully that's going up the face there. For Hindus, they view this as the stairway to the heaven of Shiva, who is one of the 3 forms of the supreme deity in Hinduism, who is said to reside on the summit, visibly on top of Mount Kailas. This is a Hindu pilgrim who's making an offering to Shiva on the summit. He's bathing in what's considered by hundreds of millions of Hindus, in particular, the most sacred lake in the world. This lake is called Manasarovar, and it's at almost 15,000 feet. The water in which he's bathing is higher than the summit of the highest mountain here in California, Mount Whitney. Now, for the Tibetans, the mountain is viewed differently. It's the pagoda palace or abode of a meditation deity whom you see here. He's the blue figure with many arms embracing his red female consort. And the symbolism here is that it represents the masculine force of compassion and the female force of wisdom. And when they come together and merge in a sense of bliss, there's an enlightenment. So it's a sort of a symbolism of the path to enlightenment. So when people come to this mountain, especially Tibetans, they don't come to the mountain to climb it, they come to walk around it. And they also view it as the center of the universe. So here is a Tibetan woman who's come to do the pilgrimage around Mount Kailas. She may have traveled for months or a long time on trucks across the Tibetan plateau to get there. And you can see from her smile that she's come for the spiritual experience of a lifetime. This is where the ritual circumambulation more or less begins. You go through this entryway through a religious structure, and then you walk around the mountain up the valley to the left. You're starting at 15,000 feet. It's about a 30-mile trek, takes you around the mountain. The high point is 18,500 feet, where you have half the air at sea level. We're breathing here. And we did it in a day and 2.5 days. The Tibetans, who are in much better shape, they grandchildren and grandparents do it in one long day, going all the way around. Now, some people take 3 weeks to go around, like this one here, because he's doing full-length body prostrations all the way around the mountain, extending his body and then bringing his feet up to where his hands are. And does this across snowfields and so on. And some people come with a minimal amount of equipment, like this pilgrim here who's traveling barefoot across the snow with no problems, no frostbite. The high point of the pilgrimage is what's called the Drolma La, which you see here. It's at 18,500 feet, and this Tibetan pilgrim has left part of herself there, a tooth or a lock of hair, symbolizing that she's relinquishing attachments to the ego in order to dedicate herself for the welfare of all humanity. Now, one of the projects that Gabriel sort of sparked off was I was in Kathmandu, and he invited me to a dinner at his place and introduced me to one of the people who was working with him at ISIMOD, an organization that Gabriel was the director of in Kathmandu. It's an intergovernmental agency of scientists from all the Himalayan countries. And so we hit it off, and then he arranged the person working with Gabriel for me to come out on a consulting project over several years to guide them through the process of trying to get the governments of India, Nepal, and China to nominate Mount Kailas and the pilgrimage routes leading to it as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Now, these are the premier protected areas around the world. And I'm just going to give you a sense of what World Heritage is about. There's one key concept, which is what the sites are supposed to be. And that is, it's called outstanding universal value. It's cultural and/or natural significance that is so exceptional as to transcend national boundaries and be of common importance for present and future generations of humanity. So Kailas, for various reasons, hasn't been nominated yet, but we hope it will sometime in the future. Now, another project that Gabriel was responsible for was Gabriel and I, when we were involved with the Mountain Institute, were at a conference in Lima, Peru, and he introduced me to an Indian scientist named Aditya Purohit, who was involved in a project at a place called Badrinath, the most important Hindu pilgrimage place in the Indian Himalayas. It's right below this peak here, which is called Nilkant, and it's sacred to the deity I mentioned, Shiva. You know, this picture here, I sort of framed it nicely, and my son looked at it and he said, you know, that bottom part of the shape here, that's the shape of India. And I said, well, so it is, so it is. So this is Shiva, and if you'll notice, he's sitting in bliss on top of Mount Kailas, and you notice this female face with water gushing out of her mouth. That's the goddess of the Ganges, the most sacred river in the world for hundreds of millions of Hindus, flows out of the Himalayas. And it refers to a very important Hindu myth, which is alive today, called the descent of the Ganges. The story is that the goddess who was up in heaven was, there was a sage on earth who appealed to her to come down and fill up the oceans that were dry. She didn't want to come down, and she said as an excuse, if I fall to the earth, the weight of my waters will shatter the earth. Shiva stepped in and said, I'll break your fall with the hair on my head, and that's what happens. Now, Indian environmentalists have pointed out that this actually corresponds to what happens because the texts say that the trees and forests in the Himalayas can be viewed as Shiva's hair. And the monsoon, the goddess does actually fall from the skies in the summer monsoon, heavy rains. And if the trees are cut down, the earth literally shatters with huge landslides and floods under impact. So this is the Hindu shrine at Badrinath, and Purohit, whom Gabriel had introduced me to, invited me to come to a tree planting ceremony and to observe it. And what had happened was this. This area, there had been a lot of trees, and then it was opened up with roads in the early 60s after a war between India and China. And then, you know, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims started coming in, the trees disappeared, and there was attempts to replant the trees, but it really didn't work. Nobody took care of them. And then Purohit had the idea of going to the chief priest of the temple and saying, well, what do you think of doing some ceremonies to bless trees in order to reestablish the sacred forest? And this immediately lit up, and they started doing it. So I was invited to come to a tree planting ceremony, and I was going to take pictures of the speakers, and they said, no, you're going to be one of the speakers. So I've spoken with a number of groups, but I've never spoken with as interesting a group as this. I was there were some scientists, there was a priest, there was this in particular, this holy man on the left, he's called the Naga Baba, and he goes around stark naked, wears a peanuts ring. He's been holding his arm up, frozen in that position for 40 years. He just trimmed his fingernails. They used to wrap twice around his arms. And he was the one who was going to bless these tree saplings that was provided by the scientists. And then people planted them, and then they were going to take care of them because they were sacred trees. So it was something, you know, rather than coming in and saying, well, you've got to do this for biodiversity reasons, that didn't make a lot of sense to local people. You say it because, you know, this is Shiva's hair and you're replanting his hair, and you'll get more blessings. That immediately resonates. So it was a very interesting thing. Now, there was an Indian general there who was in charge of India's border forces with China, and he'd come because the Naga Baba on the left had gone up to 15,000 feet in the winter and just sat there in the altogether meditating, let the snow pile up around him. And a military patrol came along and saw his trident sticking out of the snow, and they dug down, and there he was happily meditating away. So the general said, well, they know that's somebody really worth getting darshan or coming to see, get blessings from. So he brought along a military band. And as you can see here, they're dressed in turbans, some of them wearing kilts, and they're playing bagpipes. It was quite a musical event. There were a lot of people there, villagers and others and pilgrims, in particular this Swami here, and they went out and planted the trees. He was very inspired by this, and he decided to, he told me he was going to go back to South India, where he was from, and had millions of followers, and encourage them to plant trees there. So this was a way of spreading environmental ideas out over a very large area, and it eventually inspired the Sacred Mountains program that I'll talk about later, when Gabriel and I were both working at the Mountain Institute. So to go to the Middle East, this is the summit of what's usually considered, at least by Christians, Mount Sinai. Jebel Musa, it's in the Sinai Peninsula. And, you know, sometimes people will say, well, sacred mountains are something that Indians or Tibetans do. Well, no, it's very central actually in Western religion as well. The three most important events in the Old Testament, in the Bible, the Torah, the three covenants that are made with God are all connected with sacred mountains. Mount Ararat with Noah, Mount Moriah with Abraham and the binding of Isaac. And then the single most important event is the revelation on Mount Sinai when Moses goes up on it. So here you see a medieval psalter showing Moses at the burning bush at the top, and then down below he's receiving the 10 Commandments, the basis of law and ethics in much of Western society. And, you know, sometimes I'll ask people, who do you think is the most famous and influential mountain climber in Western history? And people will say, well, Sir Edmund Hillary, who climbed Everest. And I'll say, no, I think it's Moses. Certainly much more influential. Now, around the 6th century, there were Christian desert fathers who were meditating out there, and they asked the Emperor of Byzantium to build them a monastery. And this is the monastery of St. Catherine, one of the oldest monasteries, Christian monasteries in the world. It's traditionally built on the site over here on the left of the burning bush, according to tradition. Now, when we came out here before that, about around the end of the 1980s, after Israel gave this area back to Egypt, the Egyptian government announced plans to build a cable car up to the top of Mount Sinai and put a casino there. This outraged people around the world. Time magazine had an end piece castigating the government for even considering this, and they stopped it. Now, there is an example of culturally appropriate tourist development here, because down the valley, they built a hotel for tourists on the site of the making of the golden calf. So when I went there with my wife, Diane, and our 2 young sons, David and Jonathan, we climbed up in the late afternoon, and we stayed on the summit and slept out. This is the sunset. And after the sunset, my son David said, look down there, Dad, you've got to take a picture of it. And I looked down, and there's light coming up out of what's called a wadi or a canyon. There's a Bedouin village there. And it looked like the earth, the fires of hell coming out of the earth to worship, for the worshipers of the golden calf in Cecil B. DeMille's movie, The 10 Commandments. What you see there are the stars streaking in a time exposure. So moving over to Greece, if you go to northern Greece near Thessaloniki, there's a peninsula called Mount Athos, which is the center of Eastern Orthodox mysticism and monasteries. It's a long peninsula that culminates in the mountain, which you see at the top, which is Mount Athos. It rises 6,000 feet straight out of the sea on 3 sides. And along the peninsula are about 20 beautiful monasteries with incredible works of art, Byzantine monasteries of various Orthodox denominations. I spent Easter at this monastery, Grigorio, and as you can see, it kind of looks like the Big Sur coast here in California, but with these monasteries perched over the ocean like this. While I was wandering around, you have to go as a pilgrim, I ran into this delightful, well, first of all, only half of us can go wandering around legally there, because unfortunately, Mount Athos is off limits to women. And this is a bit of a problem because it's a World Heritage Site, which is supposed to be important to all of humanity, and half of humanity is not allowed to go there, which is not a good thing. Now, the monks, they justify it with a theological explanation, which you see in this picture. You can see the peninsula at the bottom, and that's the Virgin Mary. And she's the patron saint of Mount Athos. And she's considered to be jealous of all other females. So she allows no other females. So that's the monastic justification for not allowing women there. Nevertheless, I ran into this really delightful monk. He's an iconographer, makes religious icons. And I took this picture of him. He spoke English. And I said, he asked me, he said, "What kind of camera are you using?" And I said, "An Olympus. It's appropriate for Greece, don't you think?" And he said, "Yes, I have a Nikon and my name is Father Nikon." So let's come back here and bring Sacred Mountains home. This is a mountain, or actually a formation that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. This is Half Dome in Yosemite Valley. And as we'll see, I think, sacred mountains, or the idea of mountains as sacred places in a sense, played a key role in the origins of the modern day environmental movement, especially through the writings of people like John Muir. And for example, here is something that Muir wrote about the mountains. And you can see from this, it says, "Climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine flows into trees. The winds will blow their own freshness into you, and the storms their energy, while cares will drop off like autumn leaves." And one of his main reasons for preserving wilderness areas and national parks like Yosemite was to preserve them as places people could go to for spiritual and physical renewal, which is one of the main functions of sacred mountains in traditional cultures as well. So I mentioned that, I got inspired by this project in the Himalayas. What interested me was people came from all over India to this shrine, and there they were exposed to ideas about the environment and its inspirational importance and why people should take care of it. And then they could take those ideas back to the rest of the country. Well, it struck me that national parks function almost like secular shrines. People come there, they're primed to get messages about preserving the environment, which they can then take back to places far away. So out of this was born the Sacred Mountains program. And we got a grant, partly with the help of Gabriel, and basically started the program. The idea was to work with the interpretive staff at various national parks in the US to develop what are called interpretive materials, like exhibits and wayside signs, and also educational materials that were based on the evocative, cultural, spiritual, aesthetic meanings and associations of different features of nature, like rivers, birds, wildlife, mountains, not only in American culture, but Native American culture, Native Hawaiian, and cultures around the world. And the Park Service got really interested in this. I'll explain why as we go along. So we worked at a number of parks, and this is one we did at Yosemite. This is an exhibit that was around the theme of the 58 major national parks. At the time, those are the national parks that say national park at the end instead of national recreation area, for example. And basically the inspirational value of nature and wilderness in these parks. So you see these pictures, there were pictures of each park, and then a little description of the park, when it was started, and then an inspirational quote. So for Yosemite, we had this here. It's 1890, it was when it was founded as a national park. And it says, "Granite peaks and domes rise high above broad meadows, carpeted wildflowers in the heart of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Groves of giant sequoias dwarf other trees. Tall mountains, alpine lakes, and waterfalls, including the nation's highest, are found here in this vast wilderness." And then underneath this was this quote from John Muir. And I really like this quote. This is from a letter that he wrote to Ralph Waldo Emerson, trying to encourage him to come visit Yosemite. "I invite you to join me in a month's workshop with nature in the high temples of the great Sierra Crown beyond our holy Yosemite." Note, holy Yosemite, he's viewing it as a sacred place. "It will cost you nothing save the time, and very little of that, for you will be mostly in eternity." Now, for other parks, for example, for Great Smoky Mountains National Park, we had evocative quotes from the Cherokee or Hawaii volcanoes. It was Native Hawaiian. And this is a quote from the person you see here named Jerry Wolf. The Great Smoky Mountains are a sanctuary for the Cherokee people. We have always believed the mountains and streams provide all that we need for survival. We hold these mountains sacred, believing that the Cherokees were chosen to take care of the mountains as the mountains take care of us. A reciprocal arrangement which has a very powerful environmental message, not only for Cherokees, but for visitors from many other cultures. Now, in this picture here, Jerry is pointing out a buzzard that's flying, or actually a turkey vulture that's flying around. And those are people from the park. And with the Sacred Mountains program, we started a project in which we brought together the Cherokees who live next to the park with the park to come up with a series of what are called wayside signs along a very easy river trail. It's called the Alkanalufti River, that goes from a visitor center about 2 miles into the town of Cherokee, which is part of the Qualla Preserve, which is the Cherokee Indian reservation there. And what these signs did was, I'll give you an example of one. As I say, Jerry was walking along with us, pointing out various features. And the idea was for the wayside signs to link features of nature you see along this walk with Cherokee stories and traditions, especially of a spiritual nature. So here is a wayside sign that the National Park Service designed. And on the left, it has to do with a story that that's a very important one in Cherokee tradition that Jerry Wolf was telling us there. He's an elder. And the story is this. When the earth was created, it was very soft and muddy. People couldn't stand on it. So the great buzzard was sent out to fly over the land, the mud, and basically with his wings dry it off. And so where his wings went down, it pushed down valleys, and where his wings went up, it made mountains. And that's why for the Cherokees, their home country, this is their home country, is so mountainous. So the story is here on the left. There's a painting by a Cherokee artist showing the buzzard doing this. And then on the right, there's the sign in the Cherokee language. And incidentally, this syllabary, what it's called for writing Cherokee, was devised by a Cherokee in the 19th century named Sequoia. And that's what our sequoia trees are named for here in California, for Sequoia, the Cherokee elder who did this. So this is also really useful for the Cherokees because they walk this trail, and it's a way of reinforcing the teaching of their language to their children, and also getting people out and getting exercise, because there's a lot of problems with the Cherokees and a number of other American Indian tribes in the US with diabetes because of the diet and overweight. So here you see how the wayside sign works. In fact, the person who's looking at that was the head of the Mountain Institute at the time, Bob Davis and his wife. And this is a sign talking about the river as the long person, which is another Cherokee story and tradition. Very important in Cherokee culture as a religious ritual before you do anything, to go and bathe in the river and get cleansed spiritually as well as physically. So we worked with a number of parks, Mount Rainier, Rocky Mountain, Santa Monica National Recreation Area, North Cascades, and in addition, with Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. So what you see here, Hawaii has one of the most active volcanoes in the world, and it has, a number of you may know, actually it has the tallest mountain in the world, one that dwarfs Everest, if you measure it from its base to its top. That's Mauna Kea, which is about 14,000 feet high, but its base is 20,000 feet under the ocean. So it rises almost 35,000 feet, as opposed to Everest, 29,000 feet above sea level. What you see here is lava entering the ocean. So you can see the waves on the right, and the lava is pouring in, coming off of the sacred event on the sacred mountain of Kilauea. Now, when we arrived there and started working with the park had a group of Native Hawaiian elders called Kapunas, and it was called the Kapuna Committee, and they were advising the park on cultural matters. And they were bothered by, well, first of all, the lava and everything you see there is an embodiment of the volcano fire goddess called Pele, who's very important in Hawaii. And those of you who've gone to Hawaii, especially the Big Island, will probably have heard of Pele, very much alive in the culture. In the visitor center at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, there was this painting that had been made back in the 1920s by an Anglo named Howard Hitchcock. And as you can see here, she doesn't look Hawaiian. Her hair is on fire, and she kind of looks like a blonde surfer from California. And the Kapuna Committee was not happy with this at all. They really wanted something that was much more traditional. We appeared on the site, and we had funding from the Ford Foundation, so we made it available to them. And they put out a call for a traditional painting of Pele, and we helped them craft it so that it was, directed. It couldn't be exclusively from Native Hawaiians, but it, because it's a federal property. But it basically, we wanted to, make it setting in consultation with your elder, come up with a good painting. So press release went out, and the two major newspapers on Oahu at Honolulu, which is a different island, they did front page articles on this because Pele is really big in Hawaii. And the effect was, all of a sudden, the park learned that all the art stores on the Big Island of Hawaii were sold out of supplies. And then they'd expected maybe 14 or 16 submissions, and they got inundated with a tsunami of art, about 140 paintings. They were working 12-hour days trying to process them, and a lot of the people said this was the most meaningful work they'd done in their careers in the Park Service, really galvanized the people. And then the Kapuna Committee then chose the winning painting, which is this one here. And you can see looks very different. And it refers to myths about Pele. For example, the egg in her hand has to do with her sister Hiaka, who's a goddess of fertility, and she's stirring the lava. And what's interesting, the Kapuna Committee really liked this painting because of her calm, compassionate face. Normally, outsiders would think of a volcano goddess being wrathful, but to the Hawaiians, she provides new land and new nourishment because, the lava goes out and it creates new islands, extends the land that eventually they can till. Now, there were all these other paintings left over. And so they put on an exhibit of 60 of them in Volcano House, the hotel, the Science Museum, and also the art gallery called Visions of Pele. And it really galvanized and excited the whole community. And what you see here is in the middle of Kilauea has a big caldera. In the middle of it is a small crater called Halemauma. This is supposed to be the particular abode of Pele, the volcano goddess. And every year there's a ritual performance of the hula, which is being done here as a religious ritual. And many of the hula dancers are dedicated to Pele, and they're performed for that purpose. So here's a hula dancer. And finally, what I want to do is in this last couple of slides is sort of bring this all home. So this is a picture of Machu Picchu, which is a sacred site in the Andes. It's actually probably, well, according to a colleague of mine from the National Geographic, he thinks it was cited there is because it's in between four sacred mountains at the bend of a sacred river. But let me read the introductory the first paragraph of the last chapter of my book on mountains, the environment, and everyday life. For most of us, sacred mountains are remote from the experience of everyday life. They lie far off in space and time, revered by distant cultures, many of which vanished long ago. Even the peaks that we manage to climb and visit rise on the borders of our lives, removed from the cities and plains where most of us live. What is the value then of thinking about them? It is simply this: the contemplation of sacred mountains with their special power to awaken another, deeper way of experiencing reality opens us to a sense of the sacred in our own homes and communities, a sense that we need to cultivate in order to live in harmony with our environment and with each other. In looking up to the heights and reflecting on the world around them, we discover within ourselves something that enables us to lead deeper and more meaningful lives. And finally, this is a picture of our two sons, David and Jonathan, many years ago when they were small, playing in the roots of a giant sequoia tree in Kings Canyon Sequoia National Park here in California. And this is the last sentence of my book in both first and second editions. Eyes bright and clear, hearts open and free, we stand once again at the beginning and source of all that is and all that may be. Now, I've touched here on a few sacred mountains, just a sampling of them. In my book, there are at least 50 that I go into in detail, and also many other things, the role of mountains in the sacred, in literature and art, and also the spiritual dimensions of mountaineering, and sacred mountains and climate change, environmental implications. So if you're interested in learning more about sacred mountains of the world and their importance, this is the second edition of my book, which is being published by Cambridge University Press. It'll be out in April or May of this year. It is available for pre-order at the Cambridge University website or on Amazon. And I should point out, this is a picture I took a number of years ago. This is Mount Everest from Tibet. The summit of the mountain is 29,000 feet in the background. And the monastery in the foreground, you can see a religious structure called a chorten or stupa on the right, is at about 16,500 feet. That's 2,000 feet higher than the summit of Mount Whitney here. And I should point out that this is part of a project that Gabriel was very instrumental in starting and doing when he was working with the Mountain Institute, which is called the Chomalanga Nature Preserve. Chomalanga is the way the Chinese write the Tibetan name of Everest, and it's nature preserve on the Tibetan side of Everest, and it's also sort of merges with a national park on the south side of Mount Everest called Sagarmatha National Park. So thanks very much, and I've enjoyed sharing these slides with you, and I hope you find them of some inspirational value. Thank you.
Okay, I hope people can hear me. I'll be monitoring the chat. Ed, we have a first question. Can you describe the particular unique characteristics as a photographer as to how you approach these mountains to get a good photograph?
How I approach it. Well, first of all, if you want to get good photographs, it's very important the time of the day you do it. It's important to take pictures before about 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning and after about 4 or 5 in the afternoon, because then you get a much richer light. Also, the sunlight is slanting, so it draws out the texture. At midday, things are very flat. So that's one. It's also important, of course, to to consider both lighting and composition. So I focus on those two. And for me, it's sort of interesting. When I take a picture, I'll sort of move my camera around or whatever it is, and then it'll sort of click and lock in. And there's something there that's happening. It's almost subconscious. Later on, I'll go back and look at it and say, well, yeah, I took the picture because of this, this, and this. But that wasn't what I was thinking when I took the picture.
You mentioned about Everest being a minor goddess and not necessarily at the level you might have imagined. What place in the world surprised you that it is not associated, what mountain not associated with this kind of belief?
Well, let me generalize that a bit more. There's sort of, I didn't talk about it in the talk, but there's sort of 3 general ways in which mountains can be sacred. So we focused a lot here on what are called traditional sacred mountains. So traditional sacred mountain is when you have a whole web of beliefs and practices and myths, pilgrimage and so on. Those are pretty obvious, like Mount Kailas was a prime example of that. And then you've got mountains that are sacred because they may not be sacred in and of themselves traditionally, but they have sacred sites in them. For example, a temple or a shrine or a place where somebody meditated. And then I'm getting to your question, which is, then there are mountains that are sort of personally sacred. If there's a mountain, for a particular person that has some special meaning, it awakens a certain sense of wonder and awe, they feel, something about that place, then that's a sacred mountain for them, but not for others. So in that sense, every mountain can potentially be sacred. It depends on the people. Conversely, if you go to Mount Kailas and you don't sense anything there, even though Tibetans do, then the mountain really isn't sacred for you. But it has, an incredible thing. So in terms of a mountain that isn't like that, I would say, well, the obvious ones are the ones in Antarctica, because there aren't people there for whom, they're sacred. And especially mountains that are off in the distance. Or take a mountain I've been to. I was asked to lead a group of trekkers who were helping to finance the first American expedition to try to climb K2, the second highest mountain in the world, from the Chinese side. Now, K2 is called K2 and has that name rather than a local name. Everest has three names: Everest, Chomalanga, and Sagarmatha to begin with. K2 is so far back, remote, that it really, never became a sacred mountain for anybody except for mountain climbers. And K2 is the designation it had on a map. There's an interesting story about this expedition to K2 because it created a bit of a stir in the mountaineering world. It was in 1985, I think, that I went there. And there was a scientist from the University of Washington who came along, and he used a satellite to remeasure the height of K2, because the K2, which is 28,000 some feet high, the second highest mountain in the world, the altitude on the maps was from the British Survey of India back in the 19th century, where they had to do a whole bunch of intermediate triangulation stations to get there, because it was so far back, you had to go way into the mountains before you even saw it. So a mistake anywhere along there could have been magnified. So he took the data, and he didn't have a laptop in those days. He took it back and ran it through the mainframe at the University of Washington and came up with an altitude that made K2 higher than Everest. So all of a sudden there was this big buzz, and the Italians took a special interest in this because they had made the first ascent of K2, and the British, of course, had made the first ascent of Everest. And here was a chance for the Italians to beat the Brits. So they immediately sent out a team to remeasure it, and it turned out it was a bit higher than the other one, but not high enough to higher than the previous measurement, but wasn't high enough to beat Everest.
I'm just reading from the chat. If you talk primarily about situations where you had great cooperation from the native peoples around these sacred sites, did you ever have a situation where you had opposition?
Well, not myself opposition, but for example, here in the United States, for a lot of Native Americans or American Indians, the mountains are sacred and not meant to be climbed. So in a number of traditions, for example, I've written about this. It's not mine, but you've probably seen Devil's Tower in Wyoming, which featured in the film, what was it? Oh, anyways, filmed quite a while ago. But Devil's Tower is this monumental plug. It's very sacred to the Lakota and a number of other tribes and the Plains Indians there. And in particular, during the month of June, July is a particularly sacred time, and they didn't want people to climb it. And the park sort of went along with it, but there were some climbers, most climbers went along with it, but some of the climbers, the guides there said, well, climbing was their religion, and this was a violation of one of the amendments in the Constitution, so it was temporarily stopped. So it's very interesting because in a number of traditions, for example, Mount Sinai, only Moses is allowed to go up. Anybody else who goes up on the mountain in the Bible, in Exodus, will be struck down by God. So, but what's very interesting is that in certain religious traditions, the ritual is to climb the mountain. For example, Chinese sacred mountains. There are Buddhists in China and Buddhists in Tibet. In Tibet, they don't climb the sacred mountains, they walk around them. They treat them like a religious shrine. Whereas in China, they climb them to the top. And it has to do with the history of Chinese emperors climbing mountains, among other things. So I didn't personally, if people felt that, for example, I spent, this is a little different, but I spent a day with a traditional Hopi woman about the San Francisco peaks in Arizona, which are very sacred to the Hopi and the Navajo. And I talked to a number of people there, and they were willing to talk to me, but they asked me not to give their names in the book. And so I respected that. So basically, and if there were things that people didn't want me to say, but I'd say to them, if you don't want me to say anything, because a lot of material about sacred mountains is meant to be kept secret, I won't say it.
Gabriel had a comment. Gabriel, I've unmuted you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I omitted saying something about Ed and Diane that I had wanted to bring up, which is that they founded an organization called VitalArts.org to honor their son, who 3 years ago was lost in the ghost ship. And the organization provides safe and secure place for artists and musicians, and affordable places to live, which, as we know, the ghost ship did not. So I want to thank Ed and Diane for what they're doing for the artists in our area.
Thank you, Gabriel.
And I also have a question. We know from our other colleague and friend that there was human sacrifice to sacred mountains in the Andes. Could you say why they did that?
Yeah, you're referring to Johann Reinhardt, I should say. Reinhardt, Johann was also a senior fellow. Actually, we're all senior fellows now with the Mountain Institute, right? Johann and I, actually, the National Geographic Expeditions Council sent Johann and me to Greece to do research on sacred mountains in ancient Greek mythology and archaeology. And one mountain we went to, there were some reports that in the ancient times that Greeks did human sacrifices to Zeus there. So Johann was especially interested in that site. He's done this pioneering work. In fact, the highest religious and archaeological sites in the world are not in the Himalayas; they're in the Andes, in the southern Andes, northern Chile, in that area. And he's excavated the highest site in the world that's known at 22,000 feet, a mountain called Yuyayaco. Now, the reason human sacrifices were performed on the summit. He found 3 mummies that were interred there. And before I get into why they probably sacrificed them, you might say, well, why were the sites so much higher in the Andes? Well, these mountains are next to the driest desert in the world outside of Antarctica, the Atacama Desert. And because of that, there's very little snow, just powderings of snow and no real glaciers. So the Incas were able to go up to 22,000 feet with llamas and build structures and stay there for a while, something you couldn't do in the Himalayas with glaciers and so on. And probably the reason, according to Johann, is the mountains, a lot of them were worshipped as sources of water, and they were the abode of deities who controlled weather deities. So what would happen is that actually it was the children of the Inca nobility. They would be taken up there, and they were considered messengers. They were sacrificed on the summit in order to take messages to the mountain gods to bring water to these desert areas, rain and so on coming from there. And what they would do is they would take them up there and then drug them with chicha, which is an alcoholic beverage, and then either, hit them over the head or just leave them there to die and get buried there. Human sacrifice. There have been reports of human sacrifices, even in modern times, in certain cultures, for example, there were sacrifices to make a bridge, and they would sacrifice a child and put them inside a bridge to protect the bridge. But it's not only the Andes; it's also human sacrifices like this have taken place there, and also actually where human sacrifices on mountains took place in much, much larger numbers was in Mexico with the Aztecs.
Okay, Lynn had a question. Lynn?
I do. I was intrigued, Ed, about your story about being caught in an avalanche and pushed down the mountain 1,000 feet. So can you fill in the details a little? Were you buried in the snow? Were you injured? How did you get out? And then did you go down after that, or did you resume your ascent of the mountain?
Well, it was a glacier that broke off, and as far as I was concerned, I mean, the avalanches you'll see, for example, in the Sierra Nevada or the Rockies are snow slabs, wind slab avalanches, or snow breaks off. The biggest avalanches you see are when glaciers break off. They're hanging over cliffs, and then they drop down, and there are blocks of ice, and then there's snow. And if it happens near the ocean, you get icebergs. In the Himalayas or in Alaska, you get huge avalanches. So that was the kind of avalanche. So I was convinced I was going to die, and I just gave up. And basically, I don't know, just something sort of took over inside, and I was swept about 1,000 feet down, buried, couldn't breathe, couldn't move. And the short of it is that I gave up, and all of a sudden something inside just sort of went bang, and I popped out.
Okay. Last question, if I might. You did not mention any sacred mountain in Europe other than Greece.
Yeah.
Are there sacred mountains in Europe?
Yes, there are, as a matter of fact. So let's see. I have a section actually on Mont Blanc, which is not a traditional sacred mountain, but it's, for those of you who aren't familiar, Mont Blanc is the highest peak in the Alps. And it's actually associated with the birth of mountaineering, alpinism. There are some indications that it was, well, first of all, the sacred can be divine or demonic. So there's certain, stories that say that Mont Blanc had imprisoned within it Satan after St. Bernard overwhelmed him at the Great St. Bernard Pass. Now, in terms of traditional sacred mountains, there's one where there's a ritual every year in Ireland, which is in County Mayo, and that's Croagh Patrick, which is sacred to St. Patrick. And in July, on a certain day, maybe 50,000 pilgrims go up there, and many of them on their hands and knees. So that's there. There's another mountain that's sacred in the sense of having a sacred site there, which is Montserrat. If any of you ever go to Barcelona, it's worth a day trip there. It can be done from Barcelona. It's this isolated mountain that rises with these rock towers in the distance. And it looks like a castle, really incredible formations. And up there is a monastery that has a Black Madonna, which is a major pilgrimage place in Spain. So it's a really an amazing site. Then you have the Sacri Monti, sort of small sacred hills with little chapels on them in Italy. You had a number of, well, if you go to Glastonbury, which is associated with legends about King Arthur, there's Glastonbury Tor, which is a hill, which is considered sacred, that's involved with the Arthurian legends and also supposed to have been the abode previously of a Celtic deity. So there are a number of places, and what you find is a lot of sacred sites in Europe. They were originally sacred to the pre-Christian traditions, Celtic and others, and then they were basically overwhelmed by Christianity and the churches, and places like Mont Saint-Michel were built on top of them, of older sacred sites, and then converted into Christian sites. There's a very interesting pilgrimage in not too far from Torino in Italy, on the French-Italian border, of a mountain. It's about 12 or 13,000 feet high, and there's a chapel to Our Lady of the Snows that was set up there by somebody who went on the Crusades back in the Middle Ages and came back and set it up. And every year there's a pilgrimage up there to this shrine at about 12,000 feet.
Well, thank you, Ed. That was wonderful. Ginny, I'm going to turn it back over to you for a close.